Welcome everyone to Video Chess Training. This is my YouTube channel and I'm International Master William Paschall. Today we're going to take a look at my favorite game from the 2017 Tata tournament. This is Aronian against Rapport. So Levon Aronian playing white and Rapport black. Aronian playing d4, Rapport knight f6, c4, e6, and now knight to f3. I don't really know Rapport's repertoire that well. He seems to play a lot of different stuff. But Aronian playing knight f3, I don't know what would happen if Levon had played knight to c3 there, allowing the Nimzo. Maybe Rapport plays the Nimzo, maybe he plays something else. I'm really not sure. Maybe Rapport would go into Queen's Gambit, Rogozin or something like that. I don't know. But later we see Rapport playing a totally different defense against d4. In the recent Grand Prix tournament in the United Arab Emirates, Rapport actually played Chigorin as black against Hikaru Nakamura in another misadventure. But again, this is from Tata 2017 in January, and Aronian is white. It's knight f3 and b6. So the normally berserk Rapport playing here very tamely, quiet, solid defense to Queen's Indian. And I just want to say a kind of background about Richard Rapport is that he's very inconsistent. He's hyper aggressive, but when he plays against the top players, it seems like he struggles. And Aronian is actually one of, I think, the most difficult players. You know, it would be a difficult player, should be a difficult player for Rapport. Given Aronian's like really strong positional style, it's hard to get him into chaotic positions. So Rapport plays solidly here, g3 and now bishop b7, the main line of the Queen's Indian. I mean, it's interesting. A lot of strong players in the past, Karpov, Leko, playing a lot of bishop a6, and that's certainly gone through the Hungarian cycle with Leko using it so much. But Rapport playing bishop b7, the more solid classical kind of Queen's Indian, bishop g2. And now, again, you know, I would think that maybe Rapport would play something more adventurous, like bishop to b4 check, a little more life in it, but he plays quietly against Aronian, probably really looking for a draw. Bishop e7, castles, castles. Of course, it's hard to say that Rapport is ever actually looking for a draw. If you wave the red flag, you know, he's going to go crazy. Knight to c3, there's other moves there for white. Knight c3 is the main one. I mean, rook e1 is a variation worth considering for white here. And of course, the pawn sacrifice d5 wouldn't be something I'd want to play against Rapport in particular. So Aronian playing knight c3, and now black plays the classical knight e4. But it's probably worth you know, looking at other lines like knight a6, recently played against me by Grandmaster Konstantin Chernyshov, a specialty of his. Or I think Karpov actually played that line too. Or, you know, what looks interesting is d5, the line played in Karpov, Spassky, I think. So d5, nothing wrong with d5 too. Kind of, most Queen's Indian players don't really like necessarily transposing to a Queen's Gambit decline structure, but d5 looks pretty good. But anyway, knight e4, and now of course there's the draw variation, knight takes e4. Aronian wants no part in that. He's playing for a win against the unsteady Rapport. By the way, Levon Aronian, one of my favorite players in the top 10. I've always been a fan of his great style, fantastic positional play, really great endgame technique. Now, bishop f6, let's stop here for a second and consider the alternatives. Bishop f6 is a move I play as well as black when I'm looking for a solid game. But apparently, you know, f5, it's known, this is actually like the main line. It's always riskier to move your f-pawn. Apparently, you can also play even d6 here. That's rather uncommon. But d5 deserves a look, I would think. d5. And I noticed there were some recent games here. If we look here on Lichess, in the database, there's Ivanchuk Korobov 01 2015. And Tomaszewski Korobov 01 2015. Quite interesting. So this d5 against bishop d2 makes some sense to me. Because honestly, the bishop isn't very well placed in this kind of structure on d2. And on c3, for example, it's also kind of dead, with black having a pawn on d5. So I would think strategically d5 would be a variation worthy of consideration. Previously, in theory, bishop f6 and f5 have always been considered the main lines. So bishop f6, a solid move from Rapport. White has a lot of different lines, the main line being rook c1 here. Classical move. Preparing d5 when white can recapture on c3. Rook c1, let's say I gave c5 here as a line, but black can also play other moves, like I think d6 in this position is totally standard. d6, d5, and here black has all different moves. Knight takes d2, knight takes c3, bishop takes c3. Everything's been tried. It's all pretty solid for black. Another Korobov game. This guy's winning an awful lot of games with black, isn't he? In the Queen's Indian, Korobov. But anyway, Aronian goes his own way here. I had a recent game that went rook c1, d6, when my opponent played, I believe, queen c2, or no, knight takes e4, that was it. He played knight takes e4. But this is really very, very drawish. This instead, though, Aronian plays bishop e1. And it's funny because it's a move that looks very innocuous, but it's setting black with some questions as to what to do. I think that he should play d5 straight away. There's only 2 games. One, my good friend Alexander Ivanov played as black against Igor Lisi, 2011. And another one, Valery Selov, who's extremely strong, back in '96, was still in his prime, against Andrei Sokolov. So 2 games, 2 draws, 4 good players. Knight takes c3 played in 1 game. I mean, honestly, that's logical because, as I said, the bishop is not that great on c3 in this kind of structure. Alexander played bishop e4 here. Alexander Ivanov. I mean, I would think that black could also play d5. You know, there'd be nothing wrong with like d5 in this position. White would have a very small kind of advantage. But bishop e4, getting the bishop outside the pawn chain so he can follow up with d5. That makes a lot of sense. Anyway, knight takes c3, that's a move that Rapport isn't really looking for. You know, that's the thing when you play a player like Rapport. He doesn't want to trade pieces. He's kind of a maniac. He's very aggressive, but he pushes the envelope too far. You know, and I think in this game, basically Aronian just giving him some opportunity to hang himself by leaving theory. And then, you know, the solid player like the Salov or Ivanov would play something concrete. Knight takes c3. Salov played c5, by the way. I mean, that move also looks good, doesn't it? Looks like c5 just basically equalizes on the spot. I mean, the structure is a little bit weird. After like d takes c, you probably have to play knight takes c5. Although you could even play knight takes, I would think even knight takes c3 is possible. Bashing the white pawn chain. So lots of options. Yeah, c5 looks quite good. So Rapport instead comes up with a very bad novelty here, rook e8. And it's kind of difficult to understand this move. I mean, he's trying to be creative. He's obviously trying to leave book. But it's already out of book, basically, with bishop e1. And rook e8, it's not clear that the rook is going to play an active role, or necessarily, you know, after rook e8. So while it's not a terrible move, I kind of consider it dubious. I think that black should play concretely here with c5 or d5. Or even Alexander Ivanov's knight takes c3, basically playing for a draw. But rook e8 is kind of murky and strange. And now, skipping ahead, now queen c2 played by Aronian, and at this point, black should probably bail out and play knight takes c3 again. Why not play knight takes c3, trading pieces? It's the Queen's Indian. Knight takes c3, bishop takes c3, and then d5. There's no bishop e4. But d5, and now the rook there on e8 will play an active role. If white plays c takes d, look, this is the main line, I would say, like c takes d, e takes d. Now the rook plays a role, although white gets a bind on the queen side with b4 in a position that feels like a, I don't know, Petrosian variation of the Queen's Indian or some kind of weird Tartikover, but it looks like white's a little better. Aronian's certainly aware of these b4 ideas, playing a lot of Catalans, this would be likely how it would have continued. But I think Rapport letting it get out of control here. He plays d5, and suddenly he has a bad game. Knight takes e4, d takes e4, knight d2. And whichever way Black plays this, it looks like he has some problems. So here, I don't know. Queen takes d4 was interesting. This wasn't played in the game. Bishop takes d4 was played. I thought queen takes d4. Obviously, it looks scary for Black. But maybe not that bad, because after knight takes e4, the computer was looking at some weird lines here with bishop c6. But I would imagine that Rapport might find something else. Let's say bishop c6. Just for example, bishop c3, queen takes c4, white sacks a pawn, and then takes on f6, and he's pinned to this queen on c2. This is just an analysis variation. But I thought this, for example, e4 in this position, and e4, and white has compensation. I mean, white has really good dark squared bishop. The black king is kind of unsafe with the queens on the board. You know, maybe e5, and this is my analysis variation, b3, queen e6. I could see this happening, and maybe black holding on in a long struggle, where white has the initiative, attacking chances with f4, but it more or less looks like black might be able to hold on here with really accurate defense. So queen takes d4 is kind of interesting but risky looking. You know, I'm surprised that Rapport didn't play it, but he missed something very, very deep. I mean, knight takes e4, after bishop takes d4, knight takes e4 looks good, and it probably would have transposed to the game, because I think after knight takes e4, white's threatening knight f6 check, and most likely Rapport might maybe play queen c8 anyway in this position. It's probably the best move. So I'm not sure that Aronian's move order really changes too much. He played rook d1 here, very neat move, but giving black one other option, I think, to play here, knight c6, that he didn't have if Aronian had just taken on e4 right away. Instead he plays knight c6, and that's an interesting line in itself. Something like knight c6. I couldn't find anything clear for white, because the threats of knight b4 sometimes. The best is e3, bishop e5. I think bishop e5, knight takes e4, and now the point is that the queen can go to e7. And here it looks like black might be okay. I mean, the obvious move is like f4, bishop d6, knight takes d6, c takes d6. But black is actually fairly solid in this position, and white could overextend themselves. So I think white is better, slightly better. But it's not that easy. Black doesn't have any bad pieces. He can kind of defend the pawn on d6. I'm not sure this would be so easy. So this looks like a very reasonable alternative way, for maybe a better way for Rapport to have defended. But it's hard to say in retrospect what was best. Rapport instead played queen c8. If we go back here, queen c8 right away. And then it gets really interesting. Knight takes e4. And suddenly we see this rook on e8 not really having a purpose, you know, and black's queen side, the knight on b8 and the rook on a8, undeveloped. And let me tell you, people, that the most important strategic concept in the Queen's Indian is the problematic knight on b8. If you play the French defense or the Queen's Gambit declined, you know the problem piece is the bishop on c8. The problem piece in the Queen's Indian is the knight on b8. Let's get rid of these arrows. Make this red here, a red circle around the knight on b8, because that piece is a problem. It's always a problem for black, and it's no exception here. Here black has to play very artificially with bishop to c5. Now, I mean, even white could take on c5 with advantage in this position. It would be a very technical game, but I mean, I see no problem with knight takes c5. This is how bad black's position is. It's like knight takes c5, clear advantage to white. But Aronian doesn't want any kind of even half a chance that Rapport can survive this. He goes directly for the jugular with a kingside attack of knight g5. This is an extremely well thought out plan. Now maybe it looks crazy. Maybe black could have played g6 in this position. I mean, the king side looks very, very weak. There's like bishop c3 coming in, knight e4. But after you see what happens in this game, maybe black should have considered instead g6. So Rapport happily plays f5, radically weakening his position, of course. And then bishop takes b7, queen takes b7. Now, this looks good for black on the surface because the queen has this fantastic long diagonal where it has a lot of mobility. But in the meantime, white's controlling the open file, the d file. And if he ever moves his knight, white can jump on the 7th rank with rook d7. So this position is quite dangerous for black. Best move from Aronian. I gave this exclamation point. Knight g5 also an exclamation point. Rather than playing the routine knight takes c5, I think Levon really played fantastically. This is the best game, at least the most elegant and beautiful game played I've seen so far this year. So 3 months in, but we'll see. Anyway, bishop f8, probably a good defense, defending the king side, and then bang, trying to open it up with e4. This is like the critical moment. I don't have anything better to recommend than h6 because, if you take on e4 here for black, black's going to have just structural problems for the rest of the game with an isolated pawn on e6, less development. I think h6 is more or less forced. And then after this move, obviously, Rapport thought that Aronian will retreat. He'll take on e4. Maybe they'll trade the queens, and maybe white will be a little bit better in ending or something like that. But Aronian just totally surprised him here with e takes f5. This is double exclamation point move. This is not what black had bargained for. And maybe he should just take back on f5. I think this was a big mistake. Here taking the piece on g5. It's easy to see, that you're getting a piece and you're not sure that white has enough compensation. But Rapport here taking his life in his hands by grabbing this knight on g5. He had to play instead pawn takes f5 when it looks like white actually has to retreat with knight h3. And after knight h3, something like queen e4, trying to trade the queens into a slightly worse ending, I analyzed queen e4, queen b3, threatening c5 check, knight a6, and rook e1, queen f3. This is analysis, c5 for white. But there's no knockout. There is just no knockout directly for white. White has all pieces, knight coming to f4, all 5 pieces very well placed. Clear advantage. No material advantage yet. I would imagine that sooner or later white will cash in for at least a pawn advantage in the future and have good chances to win. But still, under the circumstances, this was the only realistic try for Rapport to defend this position. But it was hard to see, how far Aronian had really worked this out. After pawn takes knight on g5, f6, f6, bishop tandem with the pawn on f6, and queen coming to g6 with the rook controlling the open file. Black, no development. All the pieces except for the queen on b7 on the back rank. And the knight on b8, the classic Queen's Indian problem, blocking in the rook out of the game at a8. Just a beautiful position for white. But the denouement here is not easy to see. Maybe black was thinking, okay, I play c5, might liberate my queen laterally, my queen will help protect. But Rapport made a very bad mistake here. A very bad mistake. And it's a natural mistake. Because you see your queen, and you see the queen is very active on b7 in 2 directions. So you play c5, but he should have played c6 instead of c5. c6. Because Aronian is getting his rook active in the game with f4, f5. But the white king would have been opened up to threats from bishop c5 check, for example. If we just play c6 instead of c5 for black, we get the benefits of the defensive abilities of the queen on b7 without taking away the ability of the bishop to go to f8, c5 check. And that gives black a lot of extra options. So c6 exclamation point, only move. And then something like f4, g4. And here, in the game, the pawn on c5, Aronian plays f5, but I'm not sure it's really working as well here. with threats of bishop c5. So the best I could come up with was something like queen g6, queen f7, and then queen takes g4, when white has, you know, obviously 3 pawns for a piece, you know, very, very ominous, ominous threats, but it's not in the bag yet. Black could put up some resistance here. So major mistake by Rapport defensively, not playing c6 instead of c5. Gets excited, plays c5, kind of like a routine move you'd play in blitz or something like that, but a very bad error. So then f4, and black can't afford for this f-rook to be opened up, so he has to play g4 to keep the lines closed, and then of course f5. White's trying to just brute force the position open. And of course now we have to analyze something like e5. If black were to play e5 in this position, you know, how would white break through? But the f-pawn itself is just too strong. That's the basic idea. Just pawn takes, and then f6 is coming in. So there's no defense with trying to keep the lines closed with e5. I think that black is just lost here in the game. Basically, black is lost after the move c5. c6 the last hope, and then f4, g4, f5, white's winning. So he tries g takes f6 here, and then white blasts it open with pawn takes pawn. And now there are 2 variations, queen h7 as Rapport played, and the other key line, which isn't that obvious, and I'm sure Aronian and Rapport had to play a lot of, you know, spend a lot of time on here, is rook takes e6. Because this isn't obvious. I think a lot of beginners would have gone wrong or just not played this sacrifice because they wouldn't have seen far enough here. After rook takes e6, I spent all my analysis on queen g6 basically when I prepared this video, but it does look like rook d8 might also be an alternative and quite a reasonable move. So rook d8 is also strong, but my main line is queen g6 check, queen g7, and then this move, which is hard to see. This is a kind of grandmasterly-like calculation. You dive into g6, and then you come back with queen f5, and now we see the problem. The knight on b8, rook on a8. Effectively, black is playing with even material. You know, we've got basically, excuse me, black is playing with a rook down, not even material, but a rook down. Those 2 pieces are off the board. All of white's pieces are playing 2 rooks, bishop, and queen against bishop, queen, and rook. So effectively, black is like a rook down here in this position. I analyzed king f7 and then rook on f to e1. And this is where you see it's a rook down. Rook takes e1, rook takes e1. And it's not that black is up a piece, he's a rook down. Because in this position it's queen, bishop, and rook against queen and bishop. And there's no way to defend. Ironically, the best defense would be something like giving up the knight with knight c6, queen d5 check, queen takes c6. But, you know, black is, let's see, you know, for example, knight c6 here, queen d5 check probably forced. And obviously the black king is not safe around here. King g6. We've got the f6 pawn is a huge target. g4 is weak. And black still can't get the rook in the game. If we just do something like queen e4 check, king h5, queen takes c6, look at that rook. It only has a few squares. Rook d8, and then bishop takes f6, for example. This is not easy to calculate this far, but for a player of Aronian's caliber, it's not that difficult. So he can just see it with his intuition too. But I'm surprised they didn't play rook takes e6. Rapport instead plays queen h7, desperately trying to trade queens, of course. And then the beautiful thing about this position, and another point of c6, obviously, is that this move wouldn't have been a knockout blow, as it is here, queen g2. If black had just played c6 instead of c5, this variation wouldn't even be possible, obviously. That's why, as I said, Aronian couldn't play f5 like he did in the other variation. In this variation, he couldn't do that if the pawn was on c6. He would have had to play an entirely different attacking plan with queen g6 and stuff earlier. So we see now the weak point of c5. Really the biggest mistake of the game. And now Rapport desperately trying to save his pieces. Knight a6, rook on the 7th, rook d7. Such an elegant position. and punishment to Black for not developing the pieces and being, overly optimistic. Here, Black could try bishop e7. This looks like the only defense. He played queen h5. Queen h6 is sort of the same thing. But bishop e7 was interesting because you have to see this. Bishop takes f6, obviously. And then the question is, after rook c8, how does White win? I think that a lot of people would have been concerned playing this position for White, average players. Like, well, look at the position. It's like, I'm still down a piece. I've got a couple pawns for it, but what's the finish? Queen e2. This is brilliant. Queen e2, hitting g4, and playing for mate. The Black king is just getting mated. I mean, it's really mate or give up the bishop on e7. So Black actually has to play queen g6 and simply lose a piece. And now White's just totally winning, getting that piece back on e7. Simply bishop takes e7, game over. Game over at this level. So, great attacking game by Aronian. Rapport was not in his element. Having to defend, not really Rapport's strength. So, he didn't play this. Finally, he decided to play queen h5 in this variation instead of bishop e7, queen h5. And now it's mate in 15 according to the computer. But there's a matter of taste involved here. Rook takes f6 is best move. And then rook d8. And now the engine finds like queen d5 check. But most humans are not going to be inclined to play a variation where you're trading queens down a piece. So I think that Aronian's variation is more normal. Rook takes f8 check. Since he's not an engine, he's a human being. His intuition tells him not to trade queens, so I think this is good. And Rapport made it easy by playing king takes f8 here. It would have been better to play rook takes f8, but he's losing the queen again. If rook g7 check, king h8, and then rook g5 check wins the queen. And I don't know, it's mate in 10 probably. But it's a really, really bad situation. So Rapport, it doesn't really matter objectively. He played king takes, and now queen f1 check, and it's mate in just a couple moves. So Rapport resigned finally. The only defense would be king g8, rook g7, and then on king h8 we have rook g5 check, rook d4. This is literally the only move. Or king h7 there if you like, but obviously Black's losing everything. Rook takes h5 check, king g7, and queen f7 mate. Technically that is what would happen if Rapport hadn't resigned, but he did in fact resign after queen f1 check, justifiably so. So I think this was definitely the most beautiful game of 2017 up until March 1st. Let me know if you think differently in the comments section of the video. If you think you've seen a more beautiful game than this one in the first 3 months of 2017, let me know. Richard Rapport, he didn't play the best game possible, but he played a fighting game. He tried to play interesting chess, missed the c6 idea. But I think his whole concept was kind of risky, playing rook e8 and not developing the pieces. And this is the ultimate punishment. So very efficient attacking play by Levon Aronian, especially the sequence he played with knight g5 and e4 and f4 and f5. It just flows. But he was just absolutely brilliant to find this entire sequence so accurately. So I think a beautiful game. Again, from Tata 2017, Aronian versus Rapport. I'm International Master William Paschall. Thanks for checking out my video here on my channel. Be sure to like and subscribe. Bye-bye.